This session, this plenary session on the lone wolf, is issued in the memory of Guy Gordon, zichrono livracha. Guy was an exceptional student of mine at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy, who unfortunately passed away 5 months ago at the young age of 26. Guy was born in 1991, the youngster brother of Tom and the twin brother of Roy, which they are with us today. After being highly involved as a high school student in the Scouts Youth movement in his homeland, Givatayim, Guy joined the IDF, and for 4.5 years, he served in a confidential role in an intelligence unit, for which he has received the Distinguished President's Award. This is the highest award for a soldier at IDF. Although Guy was diagnosed with cancer while serving in the army, he insisted to continue his military service and contribute to his country. Following the army, and while fighting his disease and remaining optimistic and hopeful, Guy started his BA studies at the School of Government. My personal acquaintance with Guy was during our weekly meetings in the last few months when I visited him in his house, where I found a bright young man eager to learn and to discover new things, interested in history of all sorts, but especially passionate on the field of counterterrorism, for which he showed a grave crave. It is in this context that we are honored to have Guy's family with us today and to have this session to be held in his memory. Thank you very much.
Dan, it's all yours. Dan requests that all the speakers join him so that he can moderate them.
Thank you, John. We're going to do this in English, and the good news, perhaps, for many of you who have exhibited great patience and political will throughout this day, is that we have to end at 4:30. Maybe Stevie will allow us 5 minutes because of the important eulogy and memoriam that we just heard. This session, Lone Wolf Terrorism, has to be handled with a lot of caution, I would just like to open for 60 seconds in saying that all of us remember very recently the Barcelona attack, and the world media was highly energized after watching a single terrorist individual drive a white Fiat, killing 13 people instantly and wounding many dozens more. And the word lone wolf attack came out of the media, but in the hours after the first day, all of a sudden new linkages were made, and an attack the day before was within the hours, about 72 hours, within 72 hours of the attack, more linkages were made, more associational links were made. ISIS took the responsibility for the attack, and so we see that caution and nuance and linkages have to be looked at very carefully. We have a very, very distinguished panel to discuss this issue that is loosely called lone wolf terror, even though Brian Michael Jenkins prefers the word stray dog terror, which he wrote in a very important paper for the RAND Corporation back in 2010, which is now part of updated research. I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished panelists. 1 second. all the way down All the way down to the end is Professor Ariel Merari, Senior Research Fellow at ICT and IDC Herzliya, and Professor Emeritus, Department of Psychology at Tel Aviv University of Israel. And Dr. Merari is going to share with us some principles of lone wolf terrorism, which are extremely important to understanding the phenomenon. We move to the very distinguished Brian Michael Jenkins, who was a teacher of mine, Counter-Terrorism in Government. Mr. Jenkins is a senior advisor to the president of the RAND Corporation, the member of the Professional Advisory Board of ICT, IDC Herzliya, and Brian Michael Jenkins will discuss American jihadism, the experience of jihadism in America between September 11, 2001 and today. Next to Brian Michael Jenkins, we have Professor Boaz Ganor, our beloved Professor Boaz Ganor, who has spoken numerous times already, of course, in our conference, and the founder, executive director of the ICT, and the Ronald Lauder Chair for Counterterrorism and Dean of the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy, IDC Herzliya. And Professor Ganor is going to give us a typology of terror to make some sense out of this very complex phenomenon that we'll be hearing about just now. And then, Tricia, nice to see you. Next to Boaz, we have Dr. Tricia Bacon, who is Assistant Professor of School of Public Affairs, American University, and former counterterrorism expert in the U.S. Department of State. And we'll look forward to hearing your insights as well, Dr. Bacon. And Lieutenant General retired Orit Adato is the former Commissioner of Prison Service here in Israel, and also a research fellow at the ICT IDC Herzliya, whom I had the great privilege of working with on a counterterrorism project back in 2011, 2012. Lieutenant General Adato will talk about the important issue of radicalization in prisons and the multi-dimensional profiling phenomenon that we see of potential lone wolf terrorists that come out of the prison system, the experience of Israel and other countries. Professor Ganor, may I ask you to open? I'm going to have to request that each of us stay to as close to 7 minutes as possible. Otherwise, Stevie is going to be very upset with us, and that isn't good. Professor Ganor.
Thank you very much, Dan. We have here two professors of mine, Ariel Merari and Brian Jenkins, and a student of mine, Dan Diker. So I feel quite comfortable in the middle. The discussion that I want to hold here right now, I don't see the PowerPoint presentation, so I do it without the PowerPoint presentation. You know, I have some influence on the content of this conference, so that's why I asked the permission of the organizers to be the first to open this discussion. And the reason is because I think that we need, first of all, to discuss the typology, the classification of terrorism as a whole, and to see where the lone wolf phenomenon stands in the midst of this phenomenon. Now, even the term lone wolf today is not very well agreed all over the world. Any definition that has to do with terrorism is questionable nowadays. And I would like to suggest to differ between three types of perpetrators of terrorism. On one hand, at the end of the scale, would be the lone wolf. The lone wolf is an individual that have been radicalized, usually based on the fact that he was exposed to propaganda material, insightful material over the internet, social networks, or personal acquaintance. And one day, he decided to commit the attack. Well, I see that the presentation actually came on. So this is the lone wolf. What makes it a lone wolf is not the fact that it doesn't have any connection to terrorist organization, because it does. He was exposed to the propaganda that was put in the internet by the terrorist organization. That's why some people tend to refer to this phenomenon as if the lone wolf is not lone whatsoever. And I would argue that the lone wolf is a lone wolf because there is no operational ties between the attacker and a terrorist organization in being inspired by a terrorist organization but doesn't have an operational tie. The second type of perpetrators is the the local independent network. What's a local independent network? This is actually a bunch of lone wolves that have been radicalized together and one day decided to commit an attack. When I say a bunch of lone wolves, we are talking about a small number of people, 2, 3, 4, 5. Usually they have personal acquaintance, peers, or even, if you wish, family members. 2 examples which I can give you here in Israel not long ago, the Sarona attack in Tel Aviv, 2 cousins that conducted the attack. The attack in San Bernardino in California, 2 family members, a husband and a wife, have been radicalized together and decide to commit the attack. The third type of terrorism is a different ballgame whatsoever. The third type is the organized terrorism. The organized terrorism is what we used to know the traditional terrorist attack, which is being initiated, planned, prepared, and executed by a terrorist organization. This type of an attack is practically much more dangerous than lone wolves or even local independent networks. Because how much harm can a lone wolf inflict? Usually use cold weapons, stabbing somebody with an axe or a knife, or running down with a car. I don't want to be sound as underestimating the threat, don't get me wrong. But when you compare that to an organized terrorism, the type of 9/11, Bataclan in Paris, suicide attackers, few of them simultaneously conduct terrorist attacks, suicide attacks. Zaventem attack in Brussels, the airport and the underground at the same time. The attack in Istanbul airport. When you compare the number of casualties in both, the good news is that lone wolf attack, usually there are some exceptions, Nice is an exception, but in most cases, it's very limited with the consequences that it's causing. The bad news is that we used to believe until recently that traditional intelligence, when I say traditional intelligence, I refer to human sources intelligence, and communication intelligence. Human sources intelligence is a situation in which you have an agent in the terrorist organization that reports to you what the terrorists are planning to do. Communication intelligence is the ability to wiretap the phone conversation or computer conversation, and then again, you are being reported what they are planning to do. Traditional intelligence is based on what? On a discourse, on a discussion between at least 2 people that share a secret, and you are being able to intercept this discussion. Well, unfortunately, in the case of lone wolf, there is no discussion. There is no sharing a secret in most cases. There are some exceptions. But in most cases, it all starts and ends with the sick mind of one person. That's why traditional intelligence is useless in contending with this phenomenon of lone wolf. But I'm using past terms. We used to believe that this is the case because we have found, with the international community of counterterrorism experts worldwide, we have found that there is a compensation to the lack of human comment. And the compensation is OSINT. OSINT is open sources intelligence. Most of those terrorists, lone wolf individuals, would like to brag about that, would like to share their political statement before they conduct the attack over the internet, using social networks, the addresses on the wall of the Facebook, if you wish, in this regard. And this is a new phenomenon that actually poses a new challenge. The new challenge is how to have better technologies, big data technologies for that purpose, in order to intercept those messages, and then to establish new doctrines to know what are we going to do with this new technology. It's not enough that we know that this guy or the other guy said he's going to inflict a stabbing attack in the near future. What do you do with this information? How do you really prevent that? Those, in my view, are the challenges that we're facing, and probably we will further discuss in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ganor. Professor Merari? Oh, no, I'm going to have you come. Yeah, you're right. Professor Brian Michael Jenkins is going to share with us his experience on American jihadism 2001 until today.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the ICT for inviting me to come back. It's been a number of years that I've been coming, and each time I come, I fill a notebook with information that causes me to reflect on a lot of things that I'm working on and assist me. This is a very rich conference, as always. There is in the United States right now an intense debate going on about the threat posed by jihadist terrorists, and it really focuses on two questions. How, if we look at American jihadists, how did they come to the United States, or if they were already in the United States, how did they become jihadists? Now, whether they come from abroad or are homegrown has significant policy implications, and this is what the debate is on right now. Concern about terrorist infiltrators calls for limits on immigration, limiting the number of refugees that we will accept, tighter border controls, travel restrictions, and thorough vetting, sometimes referred to as extreme vetting, of those who come. Homegrown terrorists, really, if it's a homegrown phenomenon, it then shifts calls to domestic efforts to counter the propagation of extremist ideologies, terrorist recruiting in the community, countering violent extremism, and on domestic intelligence collection. Sometimes this debate becomes ideological and takes us into narratives for which there is insufficient evidence, empirical evidence, to support some of the presumptions upon which policies are based. So, being a hard-nosed researcher, I really wanted to tackle the question of looking at American jihadists, those who have been arrested in the United States since 9/11 for carrying out a terrorist attack, a jihadist-inspired terrorist attack, or for plotting to carry out a terrorist attack, and they were arrested and convicted. Now, there's a separate small population of people who have gone to join terrorist fronts abroad, Al-Qaeda or ISIS. I'm excluding them from this particular inquiry just for the time being, unless they were subsequently, upon a return, involved in some type of actual plotting. And I'm excluding those who were arrested purely for material support other than plotting or participating in an actual plot to carry out an attack. That is, someone who was raising funds or somebody who was retweeting messages from ISIS, something of that sort. If I put all those together, I've got several hundred people. If I confine it to those who actually participated in a terrorist attack or a terrorist plot, I have 178. Now, to begin with, that's very good news. We're talking about 16 years, 178 people. That's 11 a year. So it is not, it's not a large population. It appears that despite the continuous exhortations online by jihadist terrorist organizations to inspire terrorist attacks, thus far they're yielding meager results. Now, the other thing is when we look at this and talk about, okay, there is a small population who radicalize and then turn to violence, we're increasingly seeing a number of people who turn to violence without a lot of evidence of radicalization. And I mean, to give one concrete example, a young man arrested for being involved in a terrorist plot. In talking to him, his issue was he saw all of these beheading tapes and other atrocity things that were online, and he thought, gee, that's really cool, his term, and therefore he would convert to Islam. So it is the violence that came first, and the ideology, in a sense, that was secondary in his. By the way, 40% of the people that I'm talking about are converts. So large number of converts. So talking about 11 a year. Boaz mentioned about whether traditional intelligence is working here. Here the United States has been extremely fortunate in that our domestic intelligence, although still not optimal, is working fairly well. The authorities are uncovering and thwarting better than 80% of these jihadist terrorist plots. And they're doing that by monitoring communications online, and in many cases as a consequence of receiving tips from the community. But we have had, fortunately, only 20 actual attempted attacks. These attacks have resulted, fortunately, fewer than 100 deaths. All of these deaths are tragic and unnecessary, but in a country that averages about 15,000 criminal homicides a year, an average of 6 a year is not going to bring down the republic. The other thing it shows is that the numbers of actual perpetrators are so tiny that we are really looking for needles in haystacks when we talk about bringing these people in. So of these 178, about 48% of them are US born. So I've got 91 people who came into the United States from abroad. A smaller number since 9/11 than before 9/11 within that 91. And measure that against the fact that the United States takes in, on average, since 9/11, 75 to 100,000 refugees each year, about 1 million immigrants each year, about 10 million people on non-immigrant visas, about 22 million people a year on a visa waiver program. And so we are taking in a totals, when we put all these things together, between 30 and 40 million people a year, and we're looking for 6. And so this is a major challenge. The next one we should be really proud of as Americans. We are not importing jihadists. We are making them in the USA. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, as I said already, roughly half are US-born citizens. Most of the others are long-term residents. And in fact, this brings me to the issue of vetting. If we look at the average age of those who are foreign-born at the time of their attempted attack or at the time of their arrest, the average age is 28 years old. If we look at the average age upon arrival in the United States, it's 14.9 years. So we are talking about a 15-year gap. These are not sleepers coming in, these are kids. In fact, if we look at that another way, about 2/3 of those coming in are under the age of 18 and spend an average of 14 years before engaging in some activity that gets them arrested or actually carrying out an attack. Now, determining whether a young person is going to, what they're going to believe or do 15 years after they enter the country is not a matter of vetting. That calls for really the bureaucratic equivalent of divine foresight. We just don't know how to do that. About 2/3, 70% roughly there, are lone offenders. I won't use the term lone wolf. They believe they are connected via the internet, or they are communicating with somebody, but they are operating alone. They're not receiving direction. They're not part of a larger group. Sometimes they believe that they have joined Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but it's the FBI branch of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and that has led to the success. In some trends that we are seeing more in, the trend is moving younger perpetrators. And the second thing that we are seeing, and I think this is a consequence of ISIS advertising of atrocity as evidence of its authenticity, we are seeing more evidence of mental instability. In other words, it appears that to a certain extent the ideology is becoming a conveyor of individual disorders and discontents. So those are just some of the headlines, and we'll talk more about it later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian Michael Jenkins. Professor Merari, will you join us and share your thoughts on what Professor Merari is calling 4 principles of this type of terror phenomenon: psychological aspect, the public support for lone wolf terror, the imagined community, as Professor Merari says, via the internet, and the impact of terror organizations on the phenomenon.
Well, thank you, Dan. And in the very limited time frame that I have, I would just like to make a few quick notes. First, if I can start with what Brian just said about the small number of lone wolves or lone actors. I think this is a very important point. It is important because there are presumably in any given country tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who share the political views of those actual lone actors, but don't do anything concrete about it, even though they agree, for instance, that the West should be taught a lesson, or similar ideas, or that Islam should be promoted, or what have you. The fact that only a very, very small fraction of the people who share this belief actually do something makes us, or should make us, ask the question, why are these people who actually carry out terrorist attacks do it, whereas all the others don't? What makes them special? Why them and not the 99% of the others who believe the same thing but don't do anything about it? Now, several studies have shown already, there have been several good studies on lone wolves. Several studies have shown already that a significant proportion of lone wolves have psychological problems and problematic social background, including criminal activity, by the way. Now, it's usually several studies in the Netherlands, in the UK, in other West European countries, have usually shown that about 1/3 of the lone actors had a record of mental problems. These studies have invariably been based on secondary sources, on media records, media reports, court records, sometimes intelligence information that was gathered from various sources. But all of them have been based on secondary sources. Whereas these studies are quite good and important, I think it's now very important to do direct psychological investigation of those lone actors. One big problem is that lone actors that are dead, that are killed in the process of carrying out their attacks, are kind of hard to be psychologically investigated directly. I mean, they don't tend to answer questions. But there are, in all countries, a number of lone actors that have been caught, and they are serving time in jail. And it is very important to access them and do a thorough psychological and intelligence, I guess, information collection by professional teams. Now, another point that I'd like to make is the mention of the important factor of the scope of public support for encouraging and actually promoting lone actor activity. It has already been mentioned here by, I think, both Boaz and Brian, that lone actors are not absolutely lone. I mean, no man is an island, of course. They are influenced by the media. They meet people. Now, the sharing of ideas, the feeling that one has the support of his reference group or of the community as a whole is very important. It is important not only because the larger the number of people that share the same ideology, the larger the number of potential lone attackers, actual attackers, but also because the feeling that one has the support of his community strengthens the determination to carry out an actual attack. Now, one way to, I think, demonstrate the importance of public support for terrorist attacks is to mention the number of lone actors in Israel with that of countries in Europe, such as the UK or France or Germany. In Israel, we had, I think, from October 2015, within 3 months, we had a large number of more than 200 lone actor attacks. And this is by far larger number than in any country in the West, I think. The difference, of course, I think, is that among the Palestinians, lone attackers actually share the population's opinion, political opinion, that supports these attacks. Most of their community, 99% perhaps, or 95%, are actually applauding, of the Palestinian population applauding these attacks, even though not all of them think that it is a good idea to do it. Now, last point I'd like to make now is that in the study of lone wolves or lone attackers, and there have been a good number of good studies by now. I think one major issue has not been mentioned, and this is the need to study the reasons for the outburst of a wave of terrorist attacks. If you ask me what was the Israeli Shin Bet's greatest failure throughout its history, It wasn't the failure to prevent the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin. It was the failure to predict the outburst, the eruption of the first Intifada, and the second greatest failure of the Shin Bet, and the military intelligence for that matter too. The failure to predict the outbreak of the second Intifada. Now, terrorist attacks usually, not always, but usually come in waves. It is very important, especially in a country such as Israel, where we suddenly have hundreds of terrorist attacks in a very short period of, let's say, 3 months, but also in other countries. It is very important to predict an outbreak of a wave of terrorist attacks. Can this be done? Yes, it can. It can be done, I think, on principle, by using tools such as public opinion polls, such as monitoring social media, and so on. Now, I think this is a major challenge for security services, and I hope something will be done about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Merari. Dr. Trish Bacon, will you talk about lone wolf terrorism in the United States? As we move along, we have something in Israel called group self-sacrifice. So you have about 32 seconds to deliver yours. Would that be okay?
Yes. I think it's known as the elevator pitch, the equivalent thereof. Thank you, everyone. It is an honor to be here today and to be on such a distinguished panel talking about a very important topic. In preparation for coming here, I did a series of interviews with law enforcement and analysts and scholars in the United States to try and get my hands around the state of the threat in the US. And I encountered a fair amount of resistance to the idea of lone wolves, probably for some of the reasons we've already started to talk about. There's some confusion around the term, or it's used in different contexts. But what I repeatedly heard was that the US is not facing a lone wolf threat. It's facing a hybrid threat. Organizations still matter, but lone assailants or lone attackers have become the primary way to conduct these attacks. So one of the things that I found was that there were basically 4 different types of hybrids that emerged in terms of either current threats to the United States or areas that law enforcement analysts and scholars see as forthcoming threats. And the first kind of threat is the returning foreign fighters. And the United States is, of course, not unique in this respect. As you see the exodus of some foreign fighters from Syria and ISIS loses territory, the question is where are foreign fighters going to go next? The concern in the United States is that in order to adapt to the environment, ISIS may send individuals or small cells back to the United States with essentially giving them autonomy once they arrive in the United States. That they're not, in order to avoid detection, they're not going to continue to interact with them and guide the plots. Essentially, they've gotten the training, they've gotten the experience, and now these foreign fighters shift into a form of lone wolves, a hybrid form of that. Again, in the United States context, we're not in the same situation as a number of countries in Europe because we didn't have the same size of outflow from the United States to Syria, and we certainly have not seen a significant flow inwards. But this is a threat that the United States seems to be particularly vigilant against because, as many of us are aware, plots involving foreign fighters are almost invariably more effective, more lethal, and more successful. So that's a key area of concern in the hybrid threat that the US is grappling with. The second kind, there's been a number of really good papers and articles on, and that's the idea of the virtually planned or enabled attacks, where ISIS is able to connect with individuals in a home country and essentially help them with the plotting. It's an entirely virtual relationship, but these ISIS plotters typically are from the same country as the attackers that they've connected with, and they can offer a variety of assistance, from getting weapons to selecting targets, or even just providing that encouragement that when attackers become anxious or decide maybe they don't want to undertake this plot, they can offer key encouragement at those critical junctures to ensure that these attacks happen. As I said, these are entirely virtual relationships. So these individuals, the attackers don't belong to the organization, but they benefit from a lot of what the organization has to offer. They're clearly usually not as capable as a returning foreign fighter, but they're more capable than they would have been absent this kind of guidance from ISIS. There was a series of plots that were of particular concern in 2015, I believe, that followed this model in the United States. Less so now, but it's something that law enforcement and analysts continue to be very concerned about. Again, as we talked about the intelligence piece of it before, the upside of this kind of attack model, this hybrid model, is that there is a series of communications, which creates opportunities to intercept communications. And because the relationships are entirely virtual, there's also the ability to infiltrate these kinds of cells and operations. So there are vulnerabilities that come with this model as well. The virtually managed plots have had a range of outcomes, but overall, as I say, they're more capable. These cells or individuals tend to be more capable than they would have been absent this guidance that they got from ISIS. And in contrast to the first two types that I've talked about, which are really more Sunni jihadist or ISIS focused, there's a third hybrid type that we've seen in the United States, and that is predominantly coming from far-right extremism. And in these cases, there are individuals who are members of groups. They're fully indoctrinated into the organization, but they opt to undertake attacks without the command and control or knowledge of their organization. These tend to be more attacks of opportunity, more spontaneous than thoroughly planned operations, but they are coming from individuals who are part of organizations but are not operating under their command and control. These are obviously very difficult to detect or plan because they are spontaneous, but they also tend to be more crude and less sophisticated because they're not planned as thoroughly. The fourth hybrid type is probably closer to what a lot of people mean when they say lone wolf, and that is the inspired attack. In these instances, though, even in these instances, we tend to find that the attackers had online connections with ideologues or other people who are part of the extremist community who could encourage them. And this kind of operation spans the ideological spectrum from Sunni extremism to left-wing extremism to right-wing extremism. In contrast to the second type, we don't see a guiding or management of plots, just more of a general form of encouragement to conduct an attack consistent with their ideology. And these are perhaps the most difficult to detect, although the ability to detect them hinges very significantly on how much operational security the attackers or the cells exhibit, how many people they're telling about their plans or how many people with knowledge about their plans. This is the least trained form of the hybrid, so as a consequence, the cell or the operative comes with the skills that they have. So we see an extensive range in terms of the capability of this kind of operation. And as you can see, these differ from what is often portrayed as the true lone wolf, an individual who is radicalized, who conceives of a plot and executes a plot on their own. In all of these cases, there is often some organizational component to it, but the lone assailant is the most effective way to conduct an attack in the United States context. I think it was interesting in my interviews with people about why the hybrid model has become the predominant form of threat in the United States. Some of them are longstanding reasons, like that extremist elements or extremist movements in the United States tend to be decentralized, bordering on disorganized, in order to prevent law enforcement detection and infiltration. But another issue that came up repeatedly that I thought was interesting was that there's a sense that this generation of homegrown violent extremists don't need or want organizations to the same degree as previous generations. They need their small group or small cell of people and the virtual community, and that satisfies the needs that have typically been satisfied through more direct organizational membership. It was an observation that was offered to me a number of times. I'm not sure it's been demonstrated yet, but it's an interesting trend to watch out for. Finally, the hybrid approach is a very low-cost, high-impact investment. Organizations that employ it have to be willing to have a high rate of failure, which ISIS is much more so willing to have than its counterpart in Al-Qaeda. But for the ones that succeed, they encourage more and more. So it really does have a high investment and can pay a lot of dividends. There does appear to be concerns that there is a cycle of action and reaction in the United States, that the political extremism of the far right perpetuates Islamic extremism and vice versa. The far left and the far right are perpetuating extremism in one another as well. but that the hybrid model in particular is well suited for the environment in the United States. It's this combination that takes the elements of an organization and the elements of lone assailant and brings them together in a way that is well suited to that context. As a consequence, with that balance, it seems to be likely that this will be the model that will continue to pose a threat in the United States in the coming years. So with that, hopefully I fulfilled my mandate. Okay, very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Bacon. Eloquently said quickly. And finally, Lieutenant General Retired Orit Adato is going to help us understand the multi-dimensional profile of the lone wolf terrorist in the context of the prison system and radicalization. You have, is it all? Yeah. Is it?
Someone put the presentation.
Yeah, is that? Okay, sure.
Okay. So thank you. You see I'm short, that you see only my chin and above. That's who I am. Nevertheless, I can speak even though you don't see me. As I said, no. I'm speaking about the lone wolf phenomena, looking at the spotting pool, what it does contain. So we can see the criminals, the offenders, firstly as part of its business, or secondly, it's being shifted from being a criminal and committing offenses or crimes, to someone who is doing it in a different way. The second group, I call them the frustrated. The frustrated can be those that are feeling discriminated even though they couldn't get the education that they wanted, or they couldn't get a job after they have been educated, but it could be on a different level. His girlfriend broke up with him, or he had a quarrel with his father or mother at the same day. So he gets up in the morning, he's very frustrated, and he wanted you to know who I am. I'm here. This is me. I'm someone. The third group is what I called recruited. Some of them are recruited by the internet, the darknet, whatever ideological way. Some of them are being recruited in prison, vulnerable inmates. Let's say that prison is not a sterile zone, and it works within a framework. We don't have time to go all over, but you can see that there is an international level and a local level, so everything is being done according to this framework, while the terrorists are doing whatever they want to do, however. Let's look at the potential spotting pool for the recruitment of new terrorists. First of all is the new inmates comes into prison. The second is the population that is already there. And the third is, and we should emphasize on that as well, sometimes they're trying to recruit staff. How it happens in a way, how might it happen, of course, in a way, there is a weak population over there, and you can see them, and there is a time for religious support and for the, they are frustrated, some of them in prison. Prison is not, heaven. It's very hard to be in prison. It is not so easy to integrate into society of prison, mainly when you are a first-timer. And then come the way when you can grow a new seed of a terror potential. And I think this is the most important slide that I want to share with you. These are the vulnerable inmates that comes mostly, again, first-timers. Some of them are even converting, but some of them are not converting. They have been there in advance. And I would say a prior condition or prior phrase to say practicing religious in prison doesn't mean being a terrorist. But there is a line. And when you cross the line in one point and then it turns from practicing religious as hope, as something to desire for, as a rehabilitation process, to something different, to radicalization, extremism, and recruit. So he comes for the first time. He does not belong to organized crime gang. he is a bit concerned, let's say. He's looking for company. He's looking for socialization to be part of. This is something very humane. And they are waiting for him there. And who are they? They might be 2, 3, 4 inmates that has committed petty crime outside deliberately to get into prison, because there is the recruitment pool. They can fulfill their mission in prison. So it comes with regrouping, and we assist you, and you are safe and secure, don't worry, no one will assault you, etc., etc. Then come the second or the third step of come with us, participate in our either praise or imam courses or whatever it is related to that. Then come the next phase, which says, you know, your family doesn't have enough money at home, we'll assist them. Our people outside will assist them. Or you don't have money in your canteen account, just for example, we will give you, we will enable it for you. Or if that doesn't work, comes the other side. Your daughter is about 12 years old and she's studying in that school, specific school. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, this is enough for him to understand what they are looking for from him. And then come the indoctrination and concentration and all the needs that are at that time. And then come the next phase, you have to do something to prove us that you are committed. It could be just something that the staff will not identify as a threat of terror, of course. You just have to assault someone, another inmate with no reason, or ask your nephew or your the son to go take a paper from point A to point B. He have overcome this test mission, and then he has rewards and support and encouragement, and it goes on. And when he is released, he is a possible lone wolf, next lone wolf. In prison, why it might be an opportunity, we don't have time to go through all these, but look at the last two. The last two are the most important. Peer group means they have endless potential recruits over there. They just have to point out. And they have an endless time to do that. When you are in prison, you are not so occupied. You need to do. You have all the time that you need to do what you want to do. So they are doing it. All these, what is written here, is trying to be done in prison, even if operating and educating. And I put vocational training, because vocational training usually is a skill for an inmate to be prepared for rehabilitation, that when he will re-entry to society will be prepared enough. But they are doing it at the same time, all the time, utilizing penal inmates, etc., etc. How do you deal with it? To minimize risks in prison, of course. And the first point is increasing awareness among staff, what to look for, what to identify. And I've heard for the first time from the French representative today on the issue of intelligence, systematic professional intelligence core in prison service. It is essential, I can tell you, as a former commissioner that held thousands of terror inmates during the second intifada. It is an essential management tool, the intelligence. And of course, the third one, which is always relevant, is the cooperation between law enforcement agencies and security agencies. Because sometimes what you know inside prison is not jeopardizing your order and safety and security, but you know some information that is relevant to something that's going to happen outside, and vice versa. So the systematic cooperation between intelligence, I would say cores or figures or whatever, between law enforcement agencies is really essential. The only point, the last point that I would put on the agenda is there are many risks in how to deal with them, but one of the questions is whether to put these people that has been either coming back from ISIS or being in custody for terror attempts or whatever, whether to put them separated from the other penal inmates or to spread them all around the other inmates. Of course, people would say there are advantages and disadvantages in both methods, because if you put them separated, they can increase themselves, whatever, but if you put them spread around the other inmates, so you can see the risk over here. They have a negative influence on others, they can recruit them, they can do whatever they want to do if the staff is not aware of it, if the staff does not identify trends that's going on. Yes, it might be an option. I wouldn't say, of course, personally, I would say first prevent radicalization and then take care of de-radicalization. But if so, if the idea is, the decision is to do so and to spread them among other inmates, so you have to do some steps to prevent from the phenomena of new recruits to come. And this is by, of course, personal classification. It's more professional, not to that level of what we are doing here, but really being very cautious and very targeted in dealing with that kind of inmates and with identifying all of the vulnerable inmates and giving them other options or taking them away from these influential people. At the end, what I want to say, it's a choice between two options. Unfortunately, mostly the first is working because people say, we don't have any problems. It's not sand, it's prison here, you know, when the oyster put its hand below. No problems, everything is okay. I would recommend to put on a spot on it to begin and identify what's really is going on there below surface and to take care of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant General Orit Adato. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. We have a round of applause for all of our distinguished guests and panelists. That's it. I think we've learned that there is no one particular profile of a lone wolf. There's a lot of nuances, linkages that we have to keep in mind. There is a break now, for 20-minute break now. Please enjoy coffee, cake, and chat in the other room, and we'll see you back in about 20, 22 minutes.